say there's a complex situation that requires a tremendous amount of adult cognitive computation to solve, like what do we do about the borders? Because tearing them down is not the answer. Well, the person who stands up and says, well, I see someone who's hurt by a border and I feel empathy for them, then immediately says, therefore I'm good, which isn't so bad, but therefore I'm also morally superior to you. And this is one of the true pathologies of the empathic collectivists, is that they presume that their reflexive empathy marks them out as morally superior. And that's appalling, because part of it is, A, it's too easy. Just because I feel sorry for you doesn't mean I'm good. Partly because I can feel so sorry for you that I'm actually harmful to you. And that's what happens in the case of overprotective parents, for example. So we know perfectly well that empathy is not an untrammeled moral virtue. It has to be tempered by other virtues, and carefully tempered by other virtues. And so we have to stop allowing in our public discourse the unquestioned assumption that just because I manifest more pity in the moment than you do, that I'm somehow a morally superior individual. Yes. In fact, not only do we have to question that, we in fact we have to deeply question it and say, what makes you think that you're just not taking things too far right there? Because there's just as much error on the side of too much empathy as there is on the side of too little empathy. And that's a hard thing for everyone to learn, because empathy feels so good. Like if you feel mercy towards a suffering child, it's like, that is kind of an indication that you're an ethical person. But that's not the basis for complex and sophisticated foreign policy.
Well, we know it isn't, because we know our empathy diminishes in an almost linear way with the numbers of people to empathize with, right? So we spoke about this one night in Vancouver, but this has been tested, where if you tell someone about the plight of one little girl, you will elicit the maximum empathic response and the maximum of an altruistic response. They'll give the most amount of money they're going to give to any cause to one compelling story to save one little boy or girl. But if you start adding boys and girls to the one, keeping the one the same, people's empathy degrades and their altruism degrades. So empathy is non-quantitative almost by definition.
It's also partly because in your life, if you see a person in trouble, you might be able to do something about them. But if you see a million people in trouble, what you should probably do, at least to begin with, is run. And I mean, what are you going to do? Maybe you could give $1,000 to one person, but if you divided that up among a million, all that would happen would you would have no money, and they wouldn't be any better off.
But this is to say that so much of moral progress today entails unhooking from the highly salient empathy-driving story and connecting with the actual quantitative reality, to learn that it's 500,000 people dying every year from heart disease or whatever it is, or there's 500,000 people dying in this famine. The fact that can't be made sexy for our news cycle, right? The fact that we lose attention is something we have to figure out how to correct.
It's also akin. It's very interestingly akin to your objection that you raised before, is that there are adult forms of solving problems that aren't akin to children's play, which is something, by the way, I agree with, because I don't think that the manner in which children organize the world is the end of the way that things should be organized. It's the basis for some of the organization. But this is akin to the same issue, is that the basal motivational responses, the emotional responses, no matter how well-meaning, aren't of sufficient conceptual sophistication to deal with incredibly elaborate and complex systems. And then you have another problem too, is that, well, that's really troublesome for people, because they want to do the right thing globally. And then you tell them, look, you don't know anything. You don't know how to take this insanely complicated system that we have and improve it. And just because you're feeling pity doesn't mean that you're an expert in the retooling of hydroelectric systems, for example.
And there's one straightforward way to do that. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a brilliant Kurdish demographer who's a Swedish citizen now, who cited this fact that it costs the same amount to bring one refugee and keep them in Sweden as it does to look after 100 refugees in Jordan, Turkey, or Lebanon. Okay. So the obvious thing from that is you say, look, it's madness then to be, for instance, bringing in thousands of refugees to Sweden. You could be looking after hundreds of thousands of people in the region. Why is that still a tainted argument? It's because people aren't sure you're not going to smuggle in racism with that. That's why.
Right.
I think, are you sure you're not just coming up with this demographer
Right,
stuff in order to...
It's like you're smuggling in Hitler, like
Yeah,
the
exactly.
religious type smuggle in Jesus.
You're going to start with NGO figures, and before we know it, it's Auschwitz. That's what they think.
Right.
But here's the thing. The shortcut solution to answering almost every single one of these problems is assume that your interlocutor has good motives.
Yeah.
Assume that they are being honest in the way that they're looking at it. And that's why I
have
say...
a comment about that. Okay, so this is something I deal with in my clinical practice all the time. Okay, so imagine that you're naive. And then what you are when you're naive is someone who thinks you trust people, because you think everybody has good motivations, which is some sense what Douglas is recommending. And they say, well, that's just naive. It's like, just wait a second, though. Because here's the developmental pathway. First, you're naive and you trust everyone. And then someone cuts you off at the knees. Or multiple people do. Or maybe you cut yourself off at the knees because you trusted yourself too much and you didn't take into account the malevolence that lurks in your heart and the hearts of others. And so that you get traumatized by betrayal. And then you become cynical. And you think, Jesus, I'm a lot smarter now that I'm cynical. And you are, because cynical is actually a move up on naive. But it's not the last move. The last move is to transcend cynicism and to say that even though I know that there are just as many snakes in your heart as there are in my heart, I'm going to hold out my hand in trust, because that's the best way to elevate both of us. And that is the prerequisite for a sensible discussion.
Yeah. And to concede that, this is why I'm always going on about Aristotle on this, to concede that it's not between good and evil, but between competing virtues. That when it comes to something like the borders discussion, you're dealing with justice and mercy. You cannot only be driven by one of those virtues.
That's right.
Mercy itself will lead you to hell.
Yep.
Justice on its own, blind,
Yes.
unseeing, can lead you to hell.
Yes, exactly. Well, and so